These videos are not regular how-to videos for amateur artists, nor are they art history. Their great strength lies in their breadth and the serious overarching message to professional painters, art historians, amateur artists, museum people, and anyone interested in art in general and representational art in particular. They're an impassioned plea to all defenders of representational art not to throw the baby out with the bathwater by only going back to the Renaissance way of doing things, ignoring the stunning contribution the Boston School painters and men like John Sargent made to its brilliant evolution. What they achieved by combining good draftsmanship and painterly impressionistic seeing with Monet's startling revelations in the use of full-spectrum color should not be dismissed as mere Victorian sentimentality, but revered, studied, and learned from for its stunning visual qualities, giving the art of representational painting new powers and bringing it to new heights. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you for that nice introduction. My name, for anybody who wasn't here for that, is Paul Ingbretson. These days, I think of myself as a representative of the Boston School, but at the very least, I'm the head of the Ingbretson Studios of Drawing and Painting, which have their focus in the Boston School and training individual painters in the methods and thinking of the Boston School. And I just really appreciate, let me have a little sip first. I just want to express my appreciation, though, to the Tarbell Trust and the Groton Library for making this possible. I've been fortunate enough as the former president of the Guild of Boston Artists to have done a previous presentation using their collection and other paintings, but a presentation of Edmund Tarbell, who is the nominal head, well, we like to think of as the dean of the Boston School. And I know that for most of you, that word Boston School doesn't mean a thing. It will soon. And of course, in the course of 5 videos or 5 presentations, which I'm hoping to do, or you might call 5 seminars, what I'm hoping to do for you all, thanks to the Groton Library, you will understand, and I think you'll probably appreciate in a whole different way what you see whenever you go to the museum in Boston, where you have the most remarkable collection of their work. So thank you to the Tarbell Trust. Thank you to the Groton Public Library. And I think that's enough of the beginning. So let me just get you started up as quickly as I can. R.H. Ives Gamal was my mentor. In the master-disciple relationship, you'd say he was the guy that I studied under and gained the mastery of painting under. I'd studied previously at the Art Students League in New York with a handful of different people, but R.H. Ives Gamal has this connection to what I think of as the deep stuff, and he was a terrific educator, which I think, by the way, for you guys in Groton, should mean a great deal, since that's where he did his prep school studies. It's a real testimony. His knowledge, his erudition, his way of handling information was something I'd never seen before. I'm from out in the West, and I don't want to say anything bad about the West, but you know, between the various schools I was in, he represented something that I'd never quite seen before. Ways of approaching what he was giving us, very, very, very helpful, and made me a much better teacher. And I'm hoping to pass that on as well, the ability to teach as well as the ability to paint. But I certainly give R.H. Ives Gamal the credit for anything I can do today, and for my not just love of the Boston School, but the ability to perform, to actually use their knowledge to be a better painter. So with that said, the 5 videos I'm going to bring to you are covering the great influences of the Boston School. The Boston painters, which were Tarbell, Joseph de Camp, watch me go out the window, Frank Benson, Paxton, William Paxton, and Philip Hale. These 5 men talked among themselves about four basic influences, I apologize. I'm making 5 videos because I want to share the knowledge that they shared with one of their contemporaries, which is John Singer Sargent. So my videos are going to cover Velasquez, the connection to the Boston School through Velasquez, what Velasquez meant to them and why they used him as an example, to Vermeer, who was typical of what they were trying to get students to be aware of, and then to Chardin, and of course then finally to Monet. The Boston School is what's sometimes thought of as an Impressionist school. Today, that's in the new realism of today, which is all based on outline drawing in a sort of an earlier form, something more related to the Italians. That's become kind of a bad word. It's a bad word because it looks like there's no drawing, of course. Well, the Boston School is not a school of no drawing, but it's a school that has actually accomplished the mission of bringing that last greatest piece of truth into combination with drawing. And that truth that we're talking about now is color, light, in that whole entire world. So I hope to be able to present all this to you in the course of 5 videos, and I think without any further ado, I better get on to this. I would say before I say something I don't mean to say. So now again, I'm going to show you this book. From where I'm coming from, there is one individual who is particularly important to us, and this book was offered to me by Gamal, but is a prerequisite to anybody understanding Velasquez. It's called Velasquez, and it's written by R.A.M. Stevenson. And R.A.M. Stevenson was a student of Carolus Duran, along with Sargent and Beckwith and a few other Americans. But he was a student via Carolus Duran of the Velasquez approach to painting. And I do mean the Velasquez approach, the late Velasquez. So without any further ado, let's just get on with this. Impressionism was first fully made manifest in the work of a portrait painter, Velasquez. This is R.A.M. Stevenson speaking. And what Stevenson's talking about here, the word Impressionism, I know that most people picture Monet, and they picture a lot of broken color and a lot of bad drawing. But Impressionism is actually a different thing from that. Impressionism is, as you'll see very shortly, via pictures. Impressionism is painting the world you see as you see it, and drawing your aesthetic from that actual package, the total package of what you see before you. In the past, before that, all through the Italian culture, all the imaginative paintings they made for the church and for the state, and all of them were made out of pieces and bits. You do a drawing of this and a drawing of that, and you mash it all together and manage to somehow make it look plausible. But at a certain point, and again, Stevenson says that it's not surprising that Impressionism would first show up. Now, it's the impression, that's the eye, the impression of the eye. But he said that it's not surprising that it would first manifest itself in a portrait painting. Your whole job is to set the guy down in a chair, with the background and all that stuff, and render what you see with authority and accuracy. And so there you are, R.A.M. Stevenson. And so our presentation today, he was referred to by R.H. Ives Gamal as the greatest Impressionist. And, I mean to do a couple things here. I mean to elevate the discussion about Impressionism. At one point, Gamal points out in some of his writing, and a lot of the biggest movement in modern painting toward realism is picking an aspect of Gamal's training and leaving the Impressionist aspect out of it. But the greatest Impressionist, as Gamal said, was Velasquez. I think actually the Boston School painters are greater Impressionists than Velasquez. And that's a very interesting thing for me to say, but I think I can defend that, and I think you see the pictures defending that. Velasquez is the prototype. And after that, when you start getting people like Carolus Duran and others involved in actually bringing this stuff back, putting tons of their focus on trying to figure out what he was doing when he gets to his second phase, I think you'll see why we call him the greatest Impressionist. He certainly is 200 years, I think, before his time. So here is today's discussion is Velasquez and the Boston School. The Boston School, oh yes, in varying degrees, every one of them is a reasonable draftsman. You see the Benson and the Hale. Those two guys are the guys most caught up at this, at least in these pictures here, with the color portion, the light and the color. But all these guys are actually appreciating the light and the color. They're actually painting what the eye sees. They put people in the garden. They stand people against the sky or sit them behind tables, and they paint what they see. In that sense, they're Impressionists. So what I was saying earlier, there's an older paradigm. It's an object-based paradigm. There are people today that actually tell you that, don't you see that it's sort of, immoral to not paint objects as objects. But in fact, that is the older paradigm. Everything was done by drawing an outline around the object, usually with a drawing first, tracing that onto a canvas, and then painting in between the line. So much so that drawing was described as what happens between the contours of objects. And what you're going to see is an enormous paradigm and a sudden paradigm shift. You can see, by the way, I'm going to do this back and forth thing for a second. Here's the older paradigm, outlines everywhere. Here's this, when all of a sudden you're seeing what we call lost and found. You see edges disappear, sort of melting away, and certain edges popping forward, like the cheek on the Vermeer, certain elements popping forward, other ones drifting back. And you'll see that characteristic of all these guys. And there's our friend Velasquez painting himself impressionistically in the background of a painting. He just sets people up and paints this whole dramatic space. Chardin, Monet at the top there, Vermeer. And again, Sargent. These are my guys. These are the guys I'm talking about. These four on the left are the ones that are largely the great influence of the Boston School. Sargent, of course, is their contemporary who was, buying into the same stuff and does things in slightly different ways. And we can compare and contrast in very favorable ways to him and in some ways more favorable to the Boston School. So again, there's the portrait painter. A couple shots here just of Velasquez painting portraits. When you see these two paintings coming out of that era, you sense just the truth of those likenesses. The one on the top right, I do believe, is at the Hispanic Society in New York, and is a marvel to see. The first time you see it, you cannot believe with what simplicity that thing is made. But the truth of it, just look at the truth of it. We'll get more into precisely what that ultimately means. The truth, the element of what makes Impressionism what it is. There are 2 points I would really like to make. One is the importance of truth, and the other one is the importance of beauty. And if nothing else is learned from the Boston School, you're going to pick up that there are 2 motives. More truth, and more truth, especially about color and light. And all of it with a search for what makes it worth looking at, what makes it a pleasure to view. So here's the early Velasquez, the early training of Velasquez, all outline-based, all pieced together from drawings, or at least drawn on the canvas, and then colored in, local color. That's a thing that doesn't mean anything to you, but it merely means that you take a section like this jacket here, and you decide what color it's going to be, and you just paint it, and then you paint this, and you paint these objects one at a time. Well, you'd be saying to me probably, well, what else would you do? And that truly is the case. We think of it as the coloring book approach. So when I was a student of an Impressionist when I was young, the gentleman said to me, is that a painting or is that a colored drawing? And so that was their way of demeaning the older way of working. But you can see how solid. I mean, this is the real full development of outline and form out of outline. The contour and the modeling in between the lines. So this is the early Velasquez, and as you can see, as he's getting later, the one on the far right is where we start talking about the definitive Velasquez. This is where all of a sudden he just goes nuts. Apparently, he's now a different person. The Surrender at Breda, again, is still piecemeal. The whole thing is a relatively flat picture. You can perceive the background isn't very deep. I mean, even though it's neutral colors and has a sense of aerial perspective, this is basically a flat picture. When you look to the one on the right, you can actually see enormous depth. Even though all these people are lined up in the front, the relative amount of popping forward and going back has suddenly changed. And this whole paradigm, you're going to hear me talk more and more about this, but the paradigm seriously shifts. And all of a sudden, composition is not what it used to be. We'll quote Paul Valéry on that subject, who's a friend of Degas. Who were his contemporaries, antecedents? So these Caravaggio, Rubens, and Howells just immediately precede Velasquez. By the way, Velasquez has the distinction of being born the same year that Titian died, 1599. These guys were all a generation earlier. Franz Hals on the right is the one who's the most, you'd say, like the Impressionists. He's still a little different from them in ways that it's probably not a good thing to get into now. Rubens is a person who paints imaginative figures out of his head. Caravaggio, on the left, you can see he does exactly what the early Velasquez does. He does drawings and he models between the outlines. Drawings of figures and models between the outlines. In this next generation, this is the same generation, there are these other influences. You can see Van Dyck on the right becoming less of a cartoonist. He was a student of Rubens. He becomes far less of a cartoonist. So there's this realism thing coming along. On Poussin on the left side, he's still there in that world. Even the portrait of himself is basically an outline into modeling and when I say that, I'm really saying that he's doing objects still and not fully aware of the envelope of the light and the total package of what your eye is picking up. Rembrandt starts moving in a whole more exciting direction. Again, especially with his play of light. He's still an imaginative painter. It looks like a significant amount of what he does is out of his head. But he's got an enormous sense of light, which nobody can gainsay. And it's a factor in the work of a lot of people surrounding him. So Velasquez masters, have a look at what you're seeing here. Herrera on the left, all outline. You can see the sense of local color, the blue character in the middle, the pink, the orange. I mean, there's no sense of the interrelationship of colors, which you eventually will see with anybody who works impressionistically, but Monet really brings to the fore. And on the right, another painter, Pacheco, who and the first guy, Herrera, he spent a year or so with. By the way, I want to say this just before I go any deeper into this. I'm not a historian. I'm not interested in the history in any act, and I'm aware of the more or less moments in history. But I'm talking about the look of paintings, and I'm talking about the methods of painters, and that's all we're going to be talking about. It's going to be using your eyes, look at what you see, and start noticing differences between the way one person works and the way somebody else works. But I'm still focusing you as much as I can on the idea that we're still drawing outlines of objects and modeling in between, which is where you get all these characterizations. And by the way, the back on the far right one by Pacheco has lots in common with the Forge of Vulcan that you saw earlier by Velasquez. So the early work, what was it? Now, there's an interesting story that goes with this discussion of the early work. When my mentor, my master, R.H. Ives Gamal, was trying to figure out who to study with, he one day walked down the stairs of one of the Boston School painters. His name was Joseph de Camp. And as he got down to the bottom of the stairs, he saw that de Camp had these big photographs, large photographs of the work of Velasquez, and he saw one of the Las Alondras or Las Meninas, and he looked at them and he said, "Aren't these wonderful?" to de Camp, and de Camp says he took them and he pulled them away and he put these two on the left on top, and he says it starts here. So there's an interesting paradigm that we don't shake for a while, where everybody believes, and Gamal actually taught as if he believed, that we still need to draw outlines of objects and noodle inside them. Well, the truth is, noodle, I mean model up the form in the inside. But what you're seeing here is the early paradigm. You did outlines and you model, and you can see the cut-out look, and it's in character. It's so different in the character, I should say, from what eventually happens. But for de Camp to say to a young wannabe student, this is where it starts, learn to do this, it's a big thing for a guy who already understood Impressionism himself. And I say Impressionism meaning that grandest definition of the word, not the old one. I'm sorry, not the latest one where everything's about broken color and bad drawing. So here's the quote from Gamal. In short, a painter may properly be called an impressionist to just the extent that he renders aspects of nature as he saw them with unflinching honesty. Given its most complete expression in the art of Velasquez, who is still, this is Gamal's quote from before, who is still its greatest exemplar, Impressionism's aims has ever been to convey on canvas the impression made on the painter by the subject he elects to depict. Now that's misleading in the sense that the impression made on the painter, you might think that it made you feel good in some way, but it's not an expressionist thing. It's the impression it made on your eye. In other words, you look at a spot because it's doing this wonderful stuff and you want to have some of that, or you want to bring some of that to your audience. And so your ability to draw that forth, what's happening in this venue, this little world that you see before you, just strictly this visual world, it's a visual impression, as if you're looking at a sunset. You don't have to know how to paint suns and clouds and all those things. You have to, but it's something else. And the learning to see is very much what that's caught up in. And again, Stevenson, and I apologize for putting a bunch of quotes one after the other here, but I think it's worth it just at this moment before we break into this whole, until we have the whole chorus come into the room. Velasquez painting is a realism. This is R.A.M. Stevenson from the book I just referred to, the Velasquez book. Velasquez painting is a realism of general aspect. Now today you're talking about, and I'm very excited about this, the new tendency toward representational painting, because we're not going to lose that. I mean, humans are humans, and we want to read about ourselves. We want to see ourselves on the silver screen, and we want to see ourselves on canvas. So you're not going to get rid of it. And there's this big new wave. I was part of a period when you could hardly get an education, and one of the reasons I teach is because I found that I didn't want others to have the same struggle I did just to find information. So it's been a digging process. But anyway, so a realism what's happened is we've been taken over by a realism of outline and modeling again. And there's been a sort of a damning of Impressionism, meaning that greater thing, that thing greater than those Pizarros and people like that who make a bad name for Impressionism. And I apologize to anybody who's an art historian who sees those people as equal, but there is one Impressionist in that era, and it's Monet, the one that is the value that everybody listened to. It wasn't anybody else. Anyway, when you fail to grasp the ensemble of the Velasquez, and the ensemble is all the visual elements taken as a whole, right? When you miss its profound and touching truth, the truth of that grand relationship of facts, you can fall back on little else save a few disjointed facts of common realism. And he makes a few disgruntled comments about older drawing, but common realism. Anyway, the art of thing escapes you as the art of a Beethoven symphony escapes the man who only catches hold of occasional tag ends of tunes hanging out of a preposterous, entangled coil of sound. Now, again, Stevenson, without fear of exhausting you, it's like you're reading this book. Believe me, there's much more that's of value in that book. Now, Impressionism allows many and diverse impressions, but each records a truth of general aspect. So that's what we call the big truth, the truth of the general impression. And so the whole effect of the canvas conveys a definite idea, which has ordered every element of drawing, color, and definition. So there's an ordering that's a huge thing that you don't get until you begin to realize that we're not talking about objects anymore. Now we're talking about visual phenomena and the ordering of the elements of visual phenomena. So we're talking about chroma and color and values and sizes and edges and light effects and form, all these things dancing in sets and in correspondence with one another. So the whole effect of the canvas conveys a definite idea, ordering every element of the drawing, color, and definition. He wished any scene that he looked at in nature to be so treated in art as to express the quality and the distribution of the attention it had received from him, which you could say from his eye, in real life. So that's the visual order. And this is one of those interesting things. The Boston School, and nobody else I know of ever used that phrase, the visual order. And you're going to see me use it over and over because you have to talk. There's many different kinds of order to painting. At one point, by the way, when they found perspective, they thought suddenly they had found the key to all of composition. That suddenly, if they just had perspective, their composition would be in order. Well, it does give you a certain amount of order, but it's not visual order. So all of a sudden, we find the distribution of spots on a canvas has to be orderly, there's a certain party, a certain dance, and something way more musical than simply having the people tell the story by standing in the right place and making the right gesture. Very different mindset. So what happens when you go impressionistic, right? You could say the subject becomes light and atmosphere. Well, the visual impression just does that. When you stop drawing objects for their own sake, the subject becomes everything. And light and atmosphere suddenly, come in and start taking their own place. And that stops just being about, in fact, even Ang would say everything was flat. It was all about just a two-dimensional phenomenon and just the shapes that live in those phenomena and the way they play to each other on a flat screen. Ingres referred to painting as basically a low relief, like a sculptural relief where everything is just left and right, like the Parthenon. So all the figures are just basically designed to be left and right, and there's no depth. Well, this changes everything. And I think the reason that Velasquez went here, I honestly think this because of his personality. What I see in his personality is he went to this one, particularly this one on the left, because he was dissatisfied with the quality of truth. When he had been rendering these other things, he just said, it's just not true. And he started playing games, and you'll see him playing a lot of games 200 years before his time, with just how does the world actually work visually, not what is everything. That's the shift. And you get light and atmosphere. So here we are. This is the whole discussion. On the left, you'll see two Ingres parts of a portrait and a part of a portrait, the hand. And you'll see the dedication to the outline. It's in everything, every single thing in this thing. But this is a model of what you're doing. You're finding this exact shape and modeling it round, turning the form. Notice the difference between this and the one on the right is a Joseph de Camp. And it's one of those things, by the way, that when you start getting to this place where you're dealing with the visual for its own sake, you don't mind whether a person's wearing a veil or not wearing a veil. It's not difficult to add a veil. The veil is just part of the general impression. And I was so surprised when I looked at this, by the way, to find out that the women in that day, and this would have been around the turn of the century, that they were actually wearing all sorts of different colored veils as part of their attire. Really quite interesting. And so, of course, what painter wouldn't find ways to amuse themselves with, especially in a world that was, by the way, dressing women in black so much. But so hats became a big deal. But anyway, if you look at the hands there, do you see the relative amount of lostness? Take this entire hand on here, the whole left side of that hand is virtually lost. Significant parts of the other hand are virtually lost. What that does is it gives you an enormously greater sense of the third dimension. This painting has no depth. This painting, just between its hand and its head on the wall, all this stuff is happening that's giving you the sense of space as three-dimensional. But that's just a coincidence. I'm just simply saying what I'm trying to get people to appreciate, and what is that this is that last phase, and Gamal actually referred to it that way. This is the last phase of human development of the eye. You know, when you get to Da Vinci, people hadn't even figured out that there was a line of shadow, that shadows are relatively flat and atmospheric, and the form is entirely in the lights. Things like that were happening in the Renaissance, but it took us still 500 years, or more or less, 400 years, for somebody to turn on the lights and to turn on the color simultaneously and add this more complete element. So Gamal himself, who most of the modern realists with their outline orientation have taken to be their leader, because he was painting imaginative pictures, another discussion for another time. But because they've taken him that way, they've missed out on so much, though, so much more. So let me, again, just show you examples. See, this is the right side, is those same two hands, plus the one on the bottom is a tarbell. And I'm lining them up with all the rest of this all the quadrant on the left side, whatever that is, 2/3 of this picture. These are all Velasquez hands. Now, do you see the difference between those in the upper right corner? The top left, in the right corner, there are those three. That's a Bouguereau. That below that is an Ang, and there's another Ang on the right. And Ang, I take him because he really is. And by the way, that's Ang is Ingres. I think my French father-in-law called him Anger. He said that's the way they would pronounce it. But nevertheless, that's the outline-based approach to drawing. In the case of the sophistication of the drawing of an Ang, and his dedication to finding music in the outline is so much more sophisticated than the Bouguereau, which is it's very much the new photorealism of today. Nevertheless, I want you to understand that what I'm showing you is the basic approach to these things. One is outline into modeling, and when you're done doing all the modeling, crossing the T's and dotting the I's, you're done. In the Impressionist approach, you're actually always worried about the total package. So it's the leading element of one hand and the part of a sleeve over there and something else over here, and the play of those things in relation to each other. So instead of starting with outlines, you're starting with the spot. So Sargent himself would say, he talked about spots and angles, or points and angles, I believe is his phrase. He is quoted by a student. He was for a short time a teacher at the Slade, I believe, in London. And a student recorded some of the things he said, but she said he referred to points and angles and points. And so this idea of spots, though, you can easily see the figure on the right. And this Velasquez is very close to that. And we'll see closer stuff of all these faces again. But the two in the middle, again, are Angers, male portraits. You'll see the difference very shortly. I brought these up closer to you. You can sense that this thing has some lines. For example, there's a silhouetting edge, really beautifully made over here. But the pursuit of the silhouette in this impeccable total package of, like, let's draw the shirt now thing is very, very, very different from what you get over here, where you find, where you may, and by the way, this is Edmund Tarbell, the portrait of a judge, one of the most beautiful portraits in American, maybe in history, but in American for sure. But this leading edge here, there's a leading edge there. There's another one here, bits and pieces, the way the visual world presents them. So there's a dance of edges that's so wildly different from what you would otherwise be looking for. If you were an outline painter, you'd be worrying about all the time about modeling up the nose to be a good nose, or that nose, or whatever. And so what happened, what kept happening is you kept missing stuff. So when you look at the chair of the Bertin here in the middle, there's just something about him and his chair that have no sense of reality. There's, you know what I mean? And when I say you know what I mean the people who don't know what I mean probably hate me for saying it. But it is the old manner. It really is. Draw the shape of the chair, color it in, and that'll be good. This whole other thing is the ensemble of the whole visual world. And you can see on the right image by the Tarbell, this whole floating in space thing already with a picture that's virtually just 3 spots or 4 spots. Oh, the mosaic, I take you back a second. It's a term that comes up in a little essay called 24 Sittings with Edmund Tarbell, written by the dean of the Boston University, by the way, when the university moved from up here in Newbury, where I live, Newbury, Vermont. They took that university, went from here to being a little Bible college, and went down and found itself, which is a very funny story. But he was their first president. He was a stand-in, I guess, till they got their formal president. So Dean Warren, I believe his name, and he writes this thing, 24 Sittings. He had a portrait done with Tarbell, and Tarbell discusses with him this idea of the mosaic. Put down a touch of color in the right place and leave it, as if it were a mosaic. So it comes out of the Dutch training. So it's very characteristic. And you can see the evidence of that in a painting by Edmund Tarbell, who is doing this other guy's portrait. That isn't the dean. I couldn't find a photograph of that. It's got to be somewhere in the college, but I've never been able to find it. All right, so now, here's a question for us. If you're drawing outlines and things, and I don't know how many people have seen books which have you the how-tos, how to draw the nose, how to draw the human form, how to draw the hand. Well, in reality, that's not what's happening anymore when you become an impressionist. You actually learn how to draw the spot in the right place. And so what you see here now is this evident orientation around drawing all this stuff. And to the degree, by the way, that my mentor would say, take this little piece of paper and walk up to that eye and draw carefully all the way around the eye. And he didn't say, stand back and don't do that. Impressionists would have said, stand back and don't do that. He would have said, what do you see? And so what you see in Tarbell, in both Tarbell and Velasquez, this is Velasquez, this is a Bouguereau, this is an egg. What you see in both Tarbell and Velasquez is the spot orientation. You can see the importance of the spot and this general massing, and then you find yourself at the next piece of drawing, which is way back there. There's a little drawing here, and there's just spots of effect. And that's one of the strangest things. Any number of people who study with Gamal along with me have said that they believe this is not about effects. Well, Benson said specifically, we draw with the effects. You have to stop drawing from the outlines the way you were taught. It's very specifically a different way to work. So what's the value of anatomical knowledge? This is visual truth now. And you create the likeness, and in much more variety and much more, like visual. Look at the top, how visual that looks. The one below looks like a drawing of somebody. It has that quality of looking like, and it does, sure, it looks like the guy, all that sort of thing. It looks like a drawing of hair, a drawing of eyes. But look at you have atmosphere in the upper one. You have all sorts of ins and outs that are beyond the world of knowing noses and knowing eyes. So anatomical knowledge is all of a sudden, while useful, is all of a sudden a very secondary thing. So where does this all begin? Carlos Duran, top 2 pictures, was the teacher of Sargent. He was one of the major observers of the Velasquez phenomenon. That was his inspiration, and it was a number of other people. Manet was influenced by it. But this other gentleman named Danat, I did find finally a color version of that, which I haven't got into this slide yet. But Danat was one of the teachers of the Boston School painters, Benson and Tarbell both. Let me give you more background there. The Academy Julian, where Danat also taught, had these 2 guys and Bouguereau as their primary teachers. And by the way, students would get enormously confused because they would all take critiques from both of these guys. So one guy would come in and say, you're putting too much color, and the other guy would say, why aren't you putting more color in? And so apparently it was quite a difficult thing. But you can see the orientation is around the outline of objects and the modeling of the form. Each figure being its own color and, and maintaining its own, safe space. But Dennat, interestingly enough, so I didn't say this, that Tarbell and Benson both studied here. This is the Académie Julian in Paris at that round the, I guess, the 80s. Both these guys were born around 1860. All three of the five guys were born around that time. So they were studying with this guy. However, Dennat here, with a different background entirely on the left, and you can see the background difference is significant, took them under his wing, and they were in a private atelier and spending most of their time, apparently, with him. But that makes sense, given that their first teacher was Otto Grundmann, with the Dutch background, which is very different by this time. By the time you get to Baron Leys, his teacher, and Baron Leys was considered to be the father of realism, of the new realism. And this is what we call the new realism, though. You stop doing these paintings of gods and things like that, and you're now painting life as you see it. And the Dutch have been good at that for a long time. And it really did lead the way, in my view. So in the beginnings, the Boston School painters were trained in very much the same way. Here it is outlined again, all noodled up. There's no sense of the dance of color. It's just objects being painted the right color, roughly, for the other objects. So what's the Velasquez influence on the work of the Boston School? Let's have a good look at that. Paul Valéry, and this is a huge, huge important quote. And Paul Valéry, by the way, was picked on by Degas. He was not a painter, and Degas said, you'll never understand, to him. But my experience by reading the little bit I've read from Valéry is that he understood him better than the average lay writer. And I quote this because it's useful. As soon as a painter no longer conceives of color as local quality active in itself by contrast with other colors, but as a local effect of all the light in a space shared by all the forms it contains, as soon as he attempts to perceive this subtler repercussion and uses it to give his work a certain unity different from that of composition, and by composition he means objects, and another object standing in front in relation to each other, his conception of form, and that is the total form of the painting, is entirely changed. Followed to the limit, he arrives at Impressionism. And I was talking about the visual order and the visual impression. The whole world is shifted here. And it's already been discussed in the 1600s. The word, I think, visual order, even though these guys didn't use it, is already coming up at that time because of Velasquez's influence. So what you are seeing now is we've gone away from seeing the complete outline of carefully made objects, and now we're talking about the dance of the visual impression, the music of the distribution of effects. And that's when things start getting more interesting. And I will just say, things like this you begin to make this color right. You don't just make this right. You make this right to this red and to that red, right? See the red. These reds are playing music in relation to each other. They're dancing in size and their placements. And so there's one that's more intense, and there's one that's bigger, and there's one that's more neutral. This is what's happening. The blues are playing to blues. Light effects are playing to light effects. You suddenly are aware this is the visual world now. We're not talking about objects and meaning and stories anymore. We're talking about what really is a fundamental thing. If Aristotle, I think, if I'm quoting it right, he referred to this, I think Greeks at any rate, referred to this as an art of color. Painting is an art of color. It's a fascinating thing to think about because we've been basically using it as a way of preaching ever since the church got a hold of it, for sure, which has really been, I would say, by the way, that was really important for all that money to go to painters so they could play their games. But by the time you get to Velasquez, people began to realize the music is the music of color. The yumminess is the distribution of effects and the distribution of color and distribution of even form ideas are not forms for their own sake, for object's sake. They're playing form games in the abstract. So watch out that I don't run into the abstract world too much here. All my friends will lose me. So the top one is Edmund Tarbell again. You can see the influence, right? It's just totally obvious. It's the extension of this very thinking of this big picture. Isn't it obvious? And then all of a sudden you find yourself, this guy is still carefully hanging on to the dress. And mostly, when you get down to this cat, by the way, I'd love to show you a close-up. I don't think I could get a good enough one. When you get down to that cat, you realize for the first time there's no cat there. There's just silhouetting edges here, and nothing there, another little thing there, and you see a cat. This is the visual impression. This is the way that nature presents itself. You can figure things out yourself when you look across the room without having an outline around everything. And it does take away from some of the sense of reality, which is why the realism aspect comes in. So that top picture, you'll see that he's putting his early emphasis on the front edge of this table. It's the leading effect in the entire picture, isn't it? And then you talk about the top of the back, the girl's head on the right, and the other girl's head on the left side of her head, and these various spots. These are the distribution of effects in a certain order by strength of effect. Too much to probably communicate in this short essay, but I'm just getting you started. So, and again, I'm just referring again. I'm trying to show you these things. These are ensembles. Again, a Benson on the right. I mean, way much more in the direction of the Velasquez model. Benson on the right, DeCamp then, and Tarbell. And then Paxton, this picture makes it look better than it is, but Paxton is trained differently. Paxton is, to me, the odd guy out in the Boston school. Paxton has this the baggage of the training under Jerome, which was outline into noodling. And he would listen to these guys and all that sort of stuff. And every once in a while, he inclines toward them, but he never quite gets there. In fact, Valerie actually referred to Degas as a member of the cult of the integrity of the line. He never gave up his membership in the cult of the integrity of the outline. I feel that way about Paxton as well. And here again, just showing you that feeling that you're getting across when there's so much that's not said. There's so much that's not said in this presentation. This passage here, you're going to see more of it in time, if not in this video and other ones, where you're going to be made aware of the fact that we're drawing with spots that produce effect, and as the order of the effects, the dance of the effects, that is where the music starts, which is why, by the way, these pictures don't need to get finished. They're way beyond that point. They're already great works of art before they're noodled up to the nth degree of realism. And I say that with no reservation. So here again, we have the two portraits. It's number 2 and 4 are DeCamp, and I'm just letting you know how much like the Velasquez model, this way of painting, is. Very different from that outlined into noodling model. The other two are Velasquez. The 1 and 3 are Velasquez. And here the figure painted by 3 different people. The top right, again, is DeCamp. And then that's the Rokeby Venus, of course, and this is somewhere in the middle phase for him, by Velasquez. And then the one on the bottom left is the Paxton. And Paxton, this picture was taken off the palette by one of the heads of the school that he was teaching at. And he said, can I buy this? The school wants this because we want to have an example of how you might start one of our kinds of pictures. So this is not being started with a carefully drawn outline that you just hang on to preciously for dear life, which was very much the other model. It's actually a much bigger story than that. So there on the right is an Ingres, and you can see all the work he's doing to study up everything. And this is a full anatomical, every passage is with an outline into noodling passage. Everything's being studied up. This is on the left, you see a start by Velasquez and then one by Tarbell. What a wildly different way of starting a picture. You're starting with leading effects, powering them up to see what it's going to take to make those effects actually work. And then everything begins to be an orderly dwindling down, so to speak, or domino effect as you go to the lesser and lesser effects. So again, Paul Valery, although Degas knew, here we are, well, this way of seeing and had watched it grow up around him, he never surrendered it to the cult of the integrity of the contour. He quoted at every turn the maxims of the master of Montalban. That's Ingres that we've been looking at. Drawing is not outside, but inside the line. So if you're talking like a Boston or Velasquez painter, drawing is everything. It's everything simultaneously. And you'll have Hale, when he writes about Vermeer, actually saying that drawing is everything. There's a very funny thing because they used to say that drawing was everything, and they meant outline and form inside that line was everything. But we find out that outline is everything, including color and chroma and size of things disparately related in a picture. Drawing requires a relational thinking, spatial thinking, of all these things one to another. And then again, one should pursue, this is again back to that other way of thinking, one should pursue the contour like a fly crosses a sheet of paper. This is really careful doodling. And by the way, the model for that is a distinguished one. It's Leonardo da Vinci, who talks about sfumato, the smoke. So I'm just showing you this. This is a Raphael, the Perugino effect on him. This is actually a Perugino. This is a Raphael who was a student of Perugino. This is Titian, and there's another Titian. In each case, you can see that they have drawn around very carefully around leaves, around every branch, around everything. That's that way. Suddenly, Velasquez comes up, raised the same way. And you can find I should have shown you earlier drawings by him outdoors where he's done that. They're very careful not to put too many leaves on because it takes a lot of work, or else they mass them in and draw carefully around the outside edges. But nevertheless, by the time you get here, especially this top of this right one, you see that he's working from specks, from spots, from effects. And so the top two are Velasquez. And so this is Velasquez working from effects. He's not carefully drawing around each board and modeling it up and noodling it up. He's not even drawing completely around these characters or even these characters, although he's still got some of that baggage. He's still in those guys drawing their leading effects and not a lot more. So I better stop at that. But I'm going to show you what actually happens with the Boston School. Same two pictures, top. Do you see the connection? That's what I'm really hoping you can do. I'm hoping you can see the connection. Now we're talking about painting effects. Now you're talking about painting the world the way it visually comes to you. Not what it is, not its object meaning, but all that's there. The trees are there, the leaves are there, but more than that, the daylight is there. The distances and space are there. That's what happens when you give away, when you walk away from this, what Stevenson referred to as this primitive form of drawing. When you walk away from the outlines of objects, what we called, what my Impressionist teacher called the coloring book approach. And you get to this place where you don't know everything, and all of a sudden, I tell students, by the way, you have to let go of the side of the pool if you actually want to learn how to swim. It's just a very different model. So what's happening right here is these guys have all had to go. And by the way, they had an interesting time of it to get themselves from having been taught outlines into noodling to modeling the insides and trying to manage all the different objects to get to this place. Each of them had this interesting struggle, which you'll see in each of the painters that follow, in these guys, and you'll see it in relation to other painters that follow. So let me end with this one more Paul Valery quote. I believe this particular set are coming from a book called Degas Drawing Dance, or Degas Dance Drawing. Paul Valery, critically speaking, compositions in the grand style became dated. He's talking about his time. He's talking about before the turn of the century. He said, critically speaking, compositions in the grand style. You know what we're talking about when we talk about those. We're talking about they would always decide that history paintings were the most important paintings. David was the teacher of Ang. He was a master of that. I mean, who knows what the meaning of the oath of the tennis court is today? I mean, like nobody knows what the oath of the tennis court is. It was such an important painting at the time, though. Had to do with the French, one of the many French revolutions. But there were these things that were casts of thousands and all trying to say something really important and very bombastious and grand. Critically speaking, compositions in the grand style became dated before one's very eyes under the influence that we're seeing here, under the Velasquez power. And I'm going to give you other reasons for that. But landscapes invaded the walls, abandoned by the Greeks and Turks, the knights and the cupids. They did away with subject matter and in a short time reduced all the intellectual concerns on art to a few discussions on texture or the color of shadows. Now, that may seem brainless to us. That may seem kind of like mindless to us. But painting is not primarily, it's a visual entertainment. It's not a storytelling entertainment. It's not a philosophy class. It's actually something to do with beauty, visual beauty. You look at nature. I remember one of my friends who was a fellow student with Gamal, and he said, I used to just walk down the street and I'd look at the trees and I'd think, they're so nice to look at. They're so beautiful. Look at those colors. I mean, that's what makes us painters. It's not some grand philosophy, you see some great, by the way, you might start there, but when you have to go through and become a painter, you have to go through the humble way, which is look at nature, learn its lessons. And by the way, nature itself has always been considered a lost source. Ang painted a nude as an analogy of lost source. It's the source of all painting, is visual knowledge. And so visual knowledge has to do also with texture, color of shadows, sizes of spots, effects of light, form. So the brain became a mere retina, and there was no longer any question of expressing by means of the brush the feelings of some old men looking at a beautiful Susanna. Ooh, that's a little rough. Or the noble resistance of a great doctor to whom millions are proffered. So what? Painting just suddenly changed? Well, painting has come into its own, actually. And it's a very funny thing, because then people would say, well, then why is an abstract painting the greatest painting that ever lived? Well, the reason is because it's not human. It's just colors at that point. But the arts have always had this element of needing to be connected to us. And by the way, I use examples. Modern abstract painters, I say, which of these two paintings is more beautiful? This one by this great academic painter, which has got the same colors in it, or this one by this abstract guy? When it's easy, as plain as the nose in your face, that the abstract painter has more beautiful color. If you just said this is an art of color, you'd say the abstract painter's already won in that capacity. So with that note, I hope I can entertain you with the next few, and we'll end with, the next video will be on Vermeer, the next most important influence of the Boston School. And then we'll end with, finally we'll be ending with that series with Monet, and then get into Sargent. So thank you very much for your attention.